Vampires. Monsters that haunt our nightmares. The undead walking among the living, feasting on the blood of humans. They possess the power to live forever and enchant humans with their gaze. Maybe vampires are just characters from pages of Bram Stoker or Stephenie Meyer. Maybe they are just folklore and a manifestation of superstitions of a bygone time with uneducated populations. Or maybe, just maybe, back in time, they were truly real to these people. An actual legitimate fear that stalked the dimly lit streets of towns and villages, ready to pounce and drain the life force of anyone with the misfortune to cross paths with one. Hi everybody and welcome back to the Dark History Podcast, where we explore the darkest parts of human history. Hope everybody is well. I'm Rob, your host as always. In today's episode, we're going to delve into the folklore behind vampires and why these fictitious creatures still hold our fascination. Whether it be in books or films, the vampire still prickles our antiquated fear of the unknown. These monsters have hidden in the shadows of the human psyche for centuries, and behind these shadows and ghosts, they have made people do some terrible things. So without further ado, please sit back and relax next to the fire for more dark history. The traits of vampires are pretty well established. They have fangs, drink human blood, and can't see themselves in mirrors. They can be warded off with garlic, or killed with a stake through the heart. More modern day descriptions show vampires as brooding teenagers with skin sparkling in the sunlight. Some, like Dracula, are aristocrats who live in castles. But vampires didn't start out so clearly defined. Scholars suspect that the modern concept of these Halloween monsters evolved from various traditional beliefs that were held throughout Europe. These beliefs centered around the fear of the dead, once buried, could still harm the living. Tales of the undead consuming the blood or flesh of these beings has been found in nearly every culture around the world for many centuries. Today, these entities are predominantly known as vampires, but in ancient times, the term vampire did not exist. Blood drinking and similar activities were attributed to demons or spirits who would eat the flesh and drink blood. Even the devil was considered synonymous with vampires. Almost every nation has associated blood drinking with some kind of revenant or demon, from the ghouls of Arabia to the goddess Sekhmet of Egypt. Indeed, some of these legends could have given rise to the European folklore, though they are not strictly considered vampires by historians when using today's definition. The story of Sekhmet, the Egyptian feline warrior goddess, associated with both plague and healing, is considered by some to be one of the oldest vampire tales. Legend holds that the sun god Ra sent his daughter Sekhmet down to punish humankind for their disobedience, but after Sekhmet couldn't stop drinking blood amidst her slaughter, Ra quelled her planet-draining thirst by dyeing a bunch of beer red. Many cultures in ancient Mesopotamia had stories involving blood-drinking demons. The Persians were one of the first civilizations thought to have tales of such monsters. Creatures attempting to drink the blood of men are depicted on excavated pottery shards. Ancient Babylonia had the tales of the mythical Lilitu, synonymous with giving rise to Lilith. Ancient Greek mythology contains several precursors to modern vampires, though none were considered undead. These included the Empusa, Lamia, and the Strigas. In India, tales of Vetalas, ghoul-like beings that inhabit corpses, are found in old Sanskrit folklore. These creatures being described as undead creatures who, like the bat associated with modern-day vampirism, hangs upside down on trees and can be found in cremation grounds and cemeteries. The Hebrew word aluka, which is literally translated into leech, is synonymous with vampirism and vampires, as is motades dem, meaning bloodsucker. The most detailed description of the aluka appears in Sefer Hasidim, where the creature is understood to be a living human being, but can shape change into a wolf. It can fly by releasing its long hair, and would eventually die if prevented from feeding on blood long enough. Once dead, the creature is prevented from becoming a demon by being buried with a mouth full of earth. After the tales of gods, ghosts and ghouls, there have been particular tales throughout history of real people being accused of vampirism. In England, the earliest known account of a vampire-like creature comes from Northumbria and the town of Berwick upon Tweed. In the 12th century, The History of England by William Newburgh tells the story of a creature terrorizing the town and its people. A wealthy man had perished and rose from the grave and roamed the streets. The superstitions of the townsfolk believed that the devil was at work and soon a plague would descend on the town. So the townspeople followed the man back to his grave, exhumed his corpse, dismembered it, then burnt it. This did stop the creature haunting the town, but a plague still spread through the townsfolk, killing dozens. Another story from England sees William Doggett become the subject of a tale of the undead. In 1709, George Doddington purchased the site of an old farm and commenced building Eastbury Hall. As George died in 1720, he did not see the building completed. His nephew, George Bubb, inherited his estate and saw his house finished in 1738. George took on his uncle's name and was subsequently known as George Bubb Doddington. It is said that George tried to gain a reputable social position, but was described as an overweight dandy who dressed in a decorative fashion. George was a member of the infamous Hellfire Club and did not live a life of sobriety. George was awarded the title of Baron of Melcombe Ridge by George III, but died shortly after receiving this honour in 1762. Richard, the first Earl of Temple, inherited the house upon Baron Melcombe's death. He found the cost of running the house was extremely costly. When he died, George, the second Earl of Temple, inherited the home, and he too struggled to financially maintain it. The second Earl of Temple moved to Italy in 1795. He instructed the steward, William Doggett, to dismantle the wings of Eastbury House. This gave William the idea to make some money for himself, and he arranged to have the main house also dismantled, along with the south wing. He thought that his crime would go undetected, as he sold the building materials which were utilised in the construction at the rectory at Tarrant Gunville, Ashmore Manor and Bryston House. After stealing the money from the dismantled house, William was shocked to find that the second Earl of Temple was returning to England, and would only find the north wing and the stables remaining of his house. Instead of facing the consequences, William Doggett committed suicide by shooting himself in the jaw, with the bullet going through his head on the 23rd of June 1786. Subsequently, William Doggett was buried in the cemetery at St Mary's Church at Tarrant-Gunville. Stories soon began to circulate about William, and it's thought that he started to haunt the area. It is said that a blood stain was left on the marble floor in the room where William shot himself, taking his own life. The stain remained, no matter how much it was cleaned. Tales of doors opening by unseen hands were reported, and it's alleged that William Doggett's ghost appeared, with his face just a mass of blood. The story continued with the exhumation of William Doggett's corpse in 1845 from the graveyard. When the coffin was opened, it was noted that his body was not decomposed at all. The course of the bullet could be seen on Doggett's face, but what was scary is his face had a rosy complexion. Also, Doggett's legs were tied together with a broad, yellow ribbon. The ribbon looked as new as it had been the day William was buried. William was then thought as a vampire, and his body was dealt with in an acceptable way for the undead. The scary thing about this, he died 150 years after they exhumed his body. Now, this is where the story is conflicted. One story claims that there was no further sightings of William Doggett's ghost. Another story says that on the stroke of midnight, a coach with a headless coachman drives along and picks Doggett up. The voice of the coachman is heard coming from his neck when he asks, "Where to, sir?" Doggett replies, "Home," whereupon he climbs into the coach. The horses are whipped, and they gallop back to the house. It's alleged that Doggett then enters the house, goes into the panelled room where he shot himself over a century and a half ago, and reenacts the scene, shooting himself again. Of course, tales of vampires aren't just in England. In Slavic Europe, the vampire is intertwined with their stories and folklore. These superstitions, again, have been manifested into real life and onto real people. Joe Grado is credited as being the first possible real person to be described as a vampire in historical records. Grado was from Istria, located in modern Croatia. After his death in 1656, he came back as a Strigoi and caused hysteria to his village for 16 years. He would raise from his grave at night and knock on doors around the village. Within days, someone from the house he visited would die. He even appeared to his widow one night in her bedroom. She claimed that he would sexually assault her. When she described his appearance, she said his corpse always looked out of breath and appeared to be smiling, staring at her over her bed. The village priest tried to perform exorcism prayers on him, and when he came face to face with him, he held out a cross and yelled, "Behold Jesus Christ, you vampire, stop traumatizing us." Immediately, tears began to fall from Grado's eyes. The villagers dug up his grave and tried to pierce the corpse's heart, but the hawthorn stick could not penetrate the flesh. Finally, one villager, named Stepan Melisic, took a saw and sawed the vampire's head off. Horrible screams and blood spilled out everywhere on the grave. Finally, there was peace in the village. Two of the earliest historical records of vampire activity in Europe can be found in the Neplach Chronicles. For the year of 1336, it mentions a shepherd named Mislat from Blov. He died and was buried, but he didn't stay in the grave. Each evening he walked around, spoke to people as if being alive, and was scaring them. Soon he started killing people, and if he stopped by someone's home and called their name, said person died in 8 days. So the people of several villages decided to exhumate him and burnt the body. During the process, he let out a loud scream. Someone stabbed him with a stick, and a lot of blood came out of the wound. But after he was burnt, all of the evil events stopped. The second case happened in 1344. Neplach writes about a woman from Levin who, after being buried, came back, killed several people, and danced on them. Once she was exhumated and a stake was put through her, blood started pouring out of her as if she was alive. She also ate her clothes, and once removed from her mouth, the cloth was bloody as well. Even after that, she was still attacking villagers, so they decided to burn her. However, the wood wouldn't catch fire until they used a piece of the church roof to start it. Tales of vampires would reach the New World soon enough. Mass hysteria would grip the northern states of America during the New England vampire panic. This was in reaction to an outbreak of tuberculosis in the 19th century throughout Rhode Island, eastern Connecticut, southern Massachusetts, Vermont, and other areas of the New England states. Consumption, or tuberculosis, was thought to be caused by the deceased consuming the life of their surviving relatives. The bodies were exhumed and internal organs ritually burnt to stop the vampire from attacking the local populations and preventing the spread of the disease. One such story happened in Exeter, Rhode Island, whereby Edwin Brown was wasting away. For the better part of 2 years, he grew increasingly thin and weak, as tuberculosis ravaged the once strapping young man in March of 1892. Edwin struggled to breathe as he continually coughed up blood. He had sought a cure in the ratified air and the mineral waters of Colorado Springs, Colorado, but the 18-month trip offered no healing powers and only left him homesick for a small town in America's tiniest state. Edwin Brown returned home to Exeter, Rhode Island, where his father tilled the soil as a Yankee farmer. George Brown had watched helplessly as the disease known as consumption took the life of his wife, Mary Brown, in 1883, followed by his 20-year-old daughter, Mary Olive, 6 months later. While his only son grew weaker and weaker in the winter of 1892, tuberculosis also took his 19-year-old daughter, Mercy Lena Brown, who passed away just after a year of sickness on January the 19th, 1892. The disease that took 3 members of George Brown's family was the top killer of its time in the 18th century and the 19th century, particularly in New England. Tuberculosis passed easily between people in close quarters, which is why it tended to sweep through entire families such as the Browns. While the disease was all too common for the townspeople of Exeter, what happened next certainly wasn't. In 1892, tuberculosis was still poorly understood. It wasn't widely known what caused the disease or how it spread. Doctors were unable to explain the waves of sickness washing over George Brown's family, but relatives and friends thought they knew where they could find the cause, and it was 6 feet under. With medical science failing to help Edwin Brown, distraught Exeter residents turned to superstition and the supernatural in a desperate attempt to save his life. 200 years after the Salem witch trials, a vampire hysteria gripped the New England town. A group of Exeter residents believed that Edwin's mother, or one of his sisters, may be undead, caught between heaven and hell, and sucking the life out of him from beyond the grave, which meant the cure could rest with their bodies. With the extremely reluctant blessing of George Brown, who at first discounted the vampire theory, his relatives and neighbours visited Brown's family plot in the town at Chestnut Hill Cemetery on March the 17th, 1892. In a small graveyard behind the town's Baptist church, they exhumed the bodies of Mary Brown and Mary Olive Brown. They opened the caskets and, as would be expected, found only their bodies inside. The townspeople then turned their attention to the casket of Mercy Brown, who had died almost 8 weeks earlier. Accounts differ as to whether Mercy Brown had already been buried or if she rested in a crypt until the ground could be thawed and an undertaker could dig a grave. However, when the lid was lifted off Mercy's coffin, her body was found on her side. Her face appeared flushed, and there was blood in her heart and veins. Dr. Harold Metcalf, who had raised his objections to the entire affair, assured everybody that the lack of decomposition of Mercy Brown's body was perfectly consistent with the fact that she had been dead for less than 2 months. Knowing that medicine had done nothing to save the Browns, the people of Exeter ignored the doctor's proclamation and took the presence of fresh blood in Mercy's heart as a sign that she was undead. They gathered firewood and kindled a bonfire on a pile of nearby rocks. They then cut out Mercy's heart and lungs and cremated them on the pyre. They returned to Edwin Brown's house with the ashes of his dead sister's heart mixed with water. Edwin consumed the concoction, but the tuberculosis continued to consume him. He died 2 months later on May the 2nd, 1892. Thank you for taking the time out of your day to listen to this episode. The vampire does seem like it was a coping mechanism for people in history. They always seem to be associated with disease or plague. Maybe that was just the way these townfolk processed their loss. Take tuberculosis, for example. The reason it was called consumption was because its victims' bodies looked like they were being consumed. Untreated tuberculosis sufferers lost weight, became physically weaker, had fevers, and were coughing up blood. In addition, tuberculosis spread from person to person via the air. When an infected person exhaled, spoke, or coughed, someone nearby can inhale the TB bacteria. Other diseases, such as rabies or porphyria, also would fortify the notion of a supernatural being. Rabies infects the central nervous system, ultimately reaching the brain and causing symptoms such as anxiety, confusion, agitation, insomnia, hallucinations, and abnormal behaviour before killing the infected animal or person, and in those days was almost always fatal. Porphyria causes its sufferers sudden painful skin redness and swelling along with blistering to the skin when exposed to sunlight, a change of colour to the skin, and excessive hair growth to affected areas. Without our modern explanations to these diseases, you could see why people from the past could misinterpret these symptoms with something more supernatural. Also, people didn't really have much knowledge on how the body decomposed. So a person buried in winter would decompose a lot slower than a person who was buried in summer. They didn't know that the skin retracted, making the hair and nails appear to have grown, or fluid leakage from the mouth, giving the illusion that they had drunk blood recently. One thing I didn't touch on was murderers. Plenty of murderers have been given the moniker the vampire of. For example, Fitzharman, who was also known as the Vampire of Hanover or the Butcher of Hanover. This German serial killer is believed to be responsible for at least 27 murders and was convicted of 24. Although his criminal career began in 1898 for molesting children, it later claimed assault, petty theft and burglary. His first known murder didn't take place till September 1918. From September of 1898 to June of 1924, he would go on to rape, murder and butcher at least 27 youths, spanning from the ages of 10 to 22. He killed many of his victims by biting through their throats. He sold personal belongings acquired from his victims and reportedly sold the flesh on the black market, although this is just a rumour. Hermann is considered one of Germany's most prolific killers, both for the number of victims and the extremely grisly nature of his crimes. These people obviously weren't real vampires in the supernatural sense, but certainly behaved like one. Two people I've missed out of this sort of list of vampire tales is Vlad the Impaler and Elizabeth Bathory. Both people are covered in Season 1, so feel free to check those episodes out. These two are probably the most well known that are associated to vampires or bloodletting, and I wanted to give you some more obscure stories. Anyway, if you like the episode, please drop us a review. It helps the podcast out. If you think friends and family may like it, then share it with them. Links to all socials are below. Don't forget, if you want to support the channel, the link to the show's Patreon is below also. I hope you will be able to support the show, but if not, that's completely fine. As always, if you've been listening for a while and not subscribed, please do it, and that way you never miss an episode. So with all that out of the way, thank you again for listening. Join us next time for our next episode, as we delve into another event and more dark history.